Valley Road, South Cliff, Scarborough, Saturday afternoon, August 1954. Doris Ackroyd, 41, off the 1140 from Bradford Forster Square, stood on the step of a tall, bay-windowed boarding house with a suitcase in one hand and her younger boy's collar in the other. Her husband, Frank, combed wool at a worsted mill on Thornton Road. The mill had shut that morning for bowling tide, Bradford's own week, and by evening half the terrace streets around the mill would be dark. Doris had written to the landlady in January. She had asked, as she always did, for the second-floor room at the front, the one that caught the sea before the gulls were properly awake. The bucket and spade, bought new in April and kept since on top of the pantry shelf, were already out of the case and in her son's hands before the door had opened. She had been coming to this street for 9 years. She knew the landlady's name, the landlady's rules, the landlady's Saturday high tea. What she did not entirely know, what no one in Bradford had ever quite told her, because there had been no need to, was what this fortnight was actually for. Not the sea. Bradford had no sea, but that was not it either. What had Doris Ackroyd been arranging since January? The letter, the front room, the bucket bought in April. And what did she expect this one street in Scarborough to give her that Thornton Road on any ordinary Saturday could not? Before you can understand why Doris Ackroyd wrote to the same landlady every January for 9 years running, you need to understand what Scarborough itself had been built over 3 centuries to provide. In 1626, a spring of mineral water was found running down the cliff into the South Bay. And by 1660, a physician's book on its supposed healing properties had turned the town into the destination historians now call Britain's first seaside resort. Earlier than Blackpool, earlier than Brighton, earlier than any of them. Bathing machines followed in 1735. By the 1840s, a railway connected Scarborough to York, and by 1867, the town had built the Grand Hotel on the cliff above the spa. At the time, one of the largest hotels in Europe. Its 4 towers standing for the seasons, its 12 floors for the months, its 52 chimneys for the weeks of the year. Scarborough did not become a resort by accident. It was designed, decade after decade, to receive people who needed somewhere to be looked after. By the time Doris Ackroyd's train pulled in from Bradford, that design had been repurposed. The wool towns of the West riding, Bradford's mills closing for bowling tide, Halifax and Brighouse with their own local names for the same custom, sent their workers, not to Blackpool, the Lancashire cotton town's resort, but east, to Scarborough, Filey, and Bridlington. The boarding house was where the machinery of that older, grander spa town met the specific needs of a mill family, with 9 days of wages saved and 1 week to spend them. What did the boarding house require of Doris Ackroyd in order to give her what she had come for? The boarding house that took Doris Ackroyd's January letter had house rules posted inside the wardrobe door. Breakfast at 8, high tea at 5:30, no bathing costumes worn indoors, guests in by 10. The landlady, a widow who had run the house alone since the war and whom this script will call Mrs. Sowerby, a composite of the boarding house keeper documented across mass observation-type holiday surveys of the period rather than a named historical record, laid 7 tables for 7 households every August, and knew, by the 3rd year of a family's return, which child would not eat tinned tomatoes, and which father wanted his tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. What Mrs. Sowerby's dining room gave Doris Ackroyd at 5:30 was not a meal. It was the absence of one she had to cook. In Bradford, dinner was Doris's responsibility on every one of the 50 other weeks of the year. Planned around Frank's shift, stretched around what the week's money allowed. At Mrs. Sowerby's table for 9 days, someone else had bought it, cooked it, and would clear it away. The promenade after tea was not a walk to somewhere. It was a walk with nowhere she was required to be. This was, in its way, the whole of what the Yorkshire coast boarding house had been built to provide to a mill family. Not scenery, which Bradford's textile workers could see from any hillside, but the specific and total absence of domestic obligation for 9 measured days. What did it mean, then, that this same absence of obligation was not offered to every family that stepped off a train at Scarborough that same August? Here, the two layers of this story have to meet without softening either one. Doris Ackroyd's boarding house fortnight was real, and so was what it gave her. 9 days when someone else cooked, and a landlady who had learned her family's habits over 9 years of Januaries. It is also documented, at the national level and beyond any real dispute, that through the 1950s and into the mid-1960s, it was entirely lawful in Britain for a boarding house, hotel, or guest house to refuse a family a room on the grounds of color, and that signs to that effect. No coloreds, Europeans only, were commonplace enough in seaside and city guest house windows that the practice needed its own piece of legislation, the Race Relations Act of 1965, to become even a civil offense. No record has been located that names a specific Scarborough boarding house doing this in this decade. This script will not invent one. But the pattern it belonged to was national, ordinary, and entirely legal on the same August afternoon that Mrs. Sowerby was laying 7 tables on Valley Road. What this means is not that Doris Ackroyd's fortnight was false. It means that the same street, the same 9 days off, the same absence of cooking was available to a family that had saved the same wages and traveled on the same class of train only if the landlady at the next door, or the one after that, chose to open it. What did the Yorkshire coast boarding house season look like from that second door? And what did a family turned away on Valley Road do with the same 9 days? From Mrs. Sowerby's side of the same 7 tables, the season looked like arithmetic. A boarding house on Valley Road earned most of its year in 9 or 10 summer weeks. The rest of the calendar was maintenance, repainting, and waiting. She knew which weeks belonged to which Yorkshire town before the bookings even arrived because the mill towns staggered their closures on purpose. Bradford's bowling tide in 1 week, Halifax's wakes in another, so that the same railway line and the same run of boarding houses were not asked to take every wool town in the West riding at once. Scarborough's season was, in effect, built out of other towns' calendars. She also knew, in a way her guests mostly did not think about, what she was watching when Doris Ackroyd came down at 8 for breakfast. 9 years of the same family across the same table taught a landlady more about a household's real shape. Which year money was tight, which year a child had grown too old to want the bucket and spade, than the family had ever told her directly. The insider's observation is this. Mrs. Sowerby's dining room was not only where the Ackroyds went to be looked after, it was also, without either side quite naming it, the one place in Bradford's whole working year where somebody outside the family was paying close attention to how they were actually doing. By the middle of the fortnight, the Ackroyd children knew the rhythm of a Scarborough week better than they knew a school week. Mornings were the South Bay Beach and the bucket and spade. Afternoons, some years, meant Peace Home Park, the ornamental lake and Japanese-style gardens laid out on the North Bay side of town, built to give a Wool Town's children somewhere green and formal that Bradford's terraced streets did not have room for. On a Wednesday evening, if Frank's overtime pay had stretched that far, it meant the spa's orchestra, Scarborough was and remains, home to one of the last resident seaside orchestras left in the country, playing to a bandstand crowd in evening cardigans against the sound of the sea. None of this required much money, and that was largely the point. A woolcomber's family fortnight had to work within 9 days' wages, and Scarborough's specific architecture, a public park, a public bandstand, a public promenade alongside the paid boarding house, had been built across 3 centuries of spa town development to give a family with very little spare money somewhere formal and looked after to spend an evening without paying for it twice over. What happened to a fortnight built this precisely around free public architecture when British Rail began closing the lines that fed it? In 1963, Dr. Richard Beeching's report on the British Railway network recommended closing more than 2,000 stations and 5,000 miles of track across the country, and the Yorkshire coast lost heavily. The Scarborough-Whitby line, opened in 1885 to carry exactly this kind of holiday traffic, was recommended for closure in that report and shut for good in March 1965 over public objection that changed nothing. Scarborough's own main line to York survived. The town was too large a resort to lose entirely. But the wider Yorkshire coast network that had fed decades of Wakes Week and bowling tide traffic to Filey, Bridlington, and beyond began coming apart in the same years that another change arrived from a different direction entirely. That same year, 1965, Thomson Holidays launched what would become Britain's first mass package tour, and by the early 1970s, a fortnight with guaranteed sun in Spain could be bought for close to what a family had been paying Mrs. Sowerby for 9 days on Valley Road, without the train fare on top. What the package tour offered was real. No rain, no uncertain August, a swimming pool instead of the North Sea. What it did not offer was a landlady who had learned over 9 Januaries which room caught the morning light and which child would not eat tinned tomatoes. The brochure did not know that was what it was replacing, because it had never had to. Mrs. Sowerby's boarding house took its last full bowling tide booking from a Bradford family in the summer of 1976. What Thomson Holidays gave the Ackroyd's daughter when she took her own children to Majorca in 1978 instead: guaranteed sun, a pool, a balcony, and a price that beat the train fare and the tariff card combined. What it did not give them: a landlady who had specified, without being asked twice, the room that caught the sea before the gulls were awake. The meal nobody in the family had to cook was now simply included, an item on an invoice, rather than something a person had chosen to do for them for the 9th year running. The South Bay Promenade is still there. Peasholm Park still has its lake. The Spa Orchestra is still, remarkably, the last of its kind left in the country, still playing to whoever is on the benches on a Wednesday evening. What is gone is not the sea or the sand, or even the deck chairs. It is the 9 Januaries of letters, the room remembered without asking, and the fortnight that had been arranged in a Mill family's kitchen since April. The bucket and spade go in the hand luggage now. What did Doris Ackroyd's boarding house fortnight give her that a fortnight bought from a brochure, however good the sun, was never designed to know how to provide? If this channel is going to keep documenting what the British seaside holiday was and what it meant to the people who shaped their year around it, subscribe. There are more boarding houses, more piers, more Wednesday evening shows, more Wakes Week trains, and more landladies who knew which room you preferred before you asked. Mrs. Sowerby's dining room knew what 9 Januaries of letters were for. The Palma apartment never needed to know. And if you have a resort, a boarding house, a promenade, a pier, a fortnight, put it in the comments. If your family took the bowling tide or Wakes Week train to the Yorkshire coast, which boarding house, and did you keep going back? Next time on this channel, the Butlins camp at Filey, and what it offered that Valley Road never could. Doris Ackroyd's daughter took her own children to Palma in August 1978. The apartment had a pool and a balcony. There was no dining room at 5:30, and no landlady who remembered the room with the morning light. There was sun every day. She sent a postcard to Bradford. She did not go back to Mrs. Sowerby's. The boarding house on Valley Road took its last bowling tide booking in 1976 and closed for good 3 years later. The promenade is still there. The Spa Orchestra still plays on a Wednesday. The fortnight, arranged every January in a Mill family's kitchen, is gone.